All right, guys, welcome to another Note to File Live. It's Wednesday, 1 o'clock Eastern. Glad to have everybody here. If you're in the audience, shoot us some comments. I always like these to be sort of open conversations. First I'm going to notice, my producer, co-host, Denali. Denali, thanks for helping me out here today. Take some of the pressure off.
Yep, no worries.
And let's get right to our guest. One of my favorite people in the industry. Met not all that long ago, but already made an impression. And actually, coincidentally, we were all three part of a dive team at the innovation gathering last year, which was a lot of fun. But
The best dive team.
It was.
We won also, by the way. I'll point that out that we were the dive team who won the what was the name of the award? Does anyone remember?
Is Edison, if I remember?
I think it was Edison.
Or was it the Moonshot? One of the two.
I don't think it was Moonshot. I think it was the Edison. It was the all around. So
right idea, right?
That's right. Also, I think we could beat up any other dive team who threatens us physically.
I mean, I would say so.
Yeah, I'm just going to put that out there. Anyways, not to get ahead of myself, welcome, Denise Bronner.
Hello.
Good to see you, Denise. I'm going to open up same way I do on every show. Tell us a bit about yourself, your background, sort of what got you into clinical research, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, originally I came from academia. So I'm a scientist at heart, PhD in microbiology and immunology. I've known since I was 14 that I wanted to get my PhD. But when I got into grad school, I really loved the science, loved doing research, but I realized that I didn't really want to become a professor. But back then, when you're at the ivory tower, no one really tells you about careers outside of it. So you have no idea what it is besides being a professor. And if you think about anything outside of that, you're seen as going to the dark side. So since I love Sith Lord and all that type of stuff with Star Wars, I was like, you know what? I'm okay with that. I can go to the dark side. But I didn't know what it was. So I still went down the traditional route and did an academic postdoc where I continued to do work within immunology, but more focused on immune responses on the microbiome. And during that time, I actually ended up doing a business development fellowship. So they'll take people with a PhD, either students or postdocs, and introduce them to the world of business. And ever since that day, I said, yep, that's where I need to be. So I actually did a business competition called the UC Davis Big Bang, where I took the idea of taking spent grain from beer and turning it into a nutritious snack, and actually ended up winning, made it to the finals, and walked away with the most money that night and People's Choice, swept the food ag sectors. I was like, yeah, this is what I need to do. But I didn't get a chance to actually pursue that because my dad at the time ended up being diagnosed with multiple myeloma. So I had to help him with that. And I said I have to get a big girl job. So went into consulting, worked with top pharma companies on their feasibility strategies and programs, and then ended up being pulled in by J&J to join their feasibility center of excellence. Did that for about a year and a half, and then moved over to our DEI team, where I really helped to expand the reach and representation within the immunology portfolio. So I covered everything from IBD, maternal health, rheumatology, and dermatology. But even then, I was sitting there thinking to myself, I don't want to just have impact in one company. Is there a way to do it across the board? And because I worked with a lot of startups who were vendors in the space, I thought, is there a way to kind of work with them and help them kind of navigate pharma and med tech better? Is there a way for me to help them to learn how to add more value to pharma and to really demonstrate true value that's going to be data driven? So started Empactful Ventures and been doing this since June of last year. And I've had a mix of clients from startups to larger organizations and even in pharma. So I have to say that jump from corporate life to entrepreneurship still came back. Still somehow ended up being an entrepreneur. But I don't think I'm ever going to return back to corporate. I don't think I will. I don't think it's there for me. I like not having a boss. It's really nice.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I'll never go back. I don't think I could ever have a job again after this.
No, not a traditional job, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I'll go broke, I think, before getting a job if I have to.
Listen, there's always the option of, becoming a content creator, which I know is still hard to do, but I feel like there might be an opportunity there, but we'll see. I don't know. Depends.
Yeah, there you go. Cool. Well, tell us a little bit about Empactful Ventures. I know, and again, I was lucky to see your main stage presentation, innovation gathering as well, which I thought was really interesting, especially where, I'm on the side, so I get a somewhat limited perspective on what's going on, but it's certainly not lost to me that there are a ridiculous amount of vendors in the space. And, even we have a fair amount of direct contact with them. And then I can't imagine dealing with like the sponsor or pharma side as a vendor as well. So yeah, I guess tell us a bit about, what Empactful Ventures does and sort of, a little bit about vendor relationships.
Yeah, I would tell you, Impactful Ventures, a lot of people will think that it is kind of like a VC, fund. And I'm like, no, I'm not at that point yet where I'm investing, although I have done a little bit of on the angel side and individually. But Impactful Ventures really came about because I was like, how do you remain or keep empathy in with impact? And I've noticed that a lot of times when people think about things that are more of a passion-driven type of focus of a company, that they're not really able to be profitable, that there's no opportunity for them to scale, that they may be too niche. And I really want to change that perspective. And it's the same type of perspective that I had when I was in, pharma, and thinking about this idea of like representation in trials, and it's a challenge. And I said, why do we always view it as a challenge from a deficit and not view it as an opportunity? So the tagline of Impactful Ventures is where passion meets profit, and really helping companies to understand that you can still have passion and be mission driven, but still be able to have that impact on an economic scale. So really what I focus on is really helping companies that are large or small really think about their strategy. So if you're thinking about new capabilities, how are you going to kind of communicate the impact it can have on another business? How are you showing metrics that really demonstrate the impact? So relevant to things that your clients will care about. So pharma, as you know, cares about costs, timelines, and patients. And if you're able to kind of help them reduce the costs, shorten their timelines, and get the patients in faster, or more patients in, they're going to love you for it. So how do you tie these things back in, even if you're not the traditional recruitment type of vendor? But I've also worked with larger organizations as well that have tons of data and are like, well, what can we do with this data? How do we use this to inform our strategy, to inform industry? So I work with teams, do workshops, and help them to think about it, help them to say where they're on the right track and where they're not. But also just really thinking about this from a business perspective. How do you identify what the core offerings are? How do you go about identifying the impact? And then how are you actually messaging that? Because that's the other piece of it too. You could have a really great business, but you're not messaging it properly. You don't have the right stage presence. So that's what Impactful Ventures really helps out with. I would love to work with investors who are in this space to say, is there a way to kind of work with them during the due diligence to say, is this a good company to invest in? Is there, something that they're missing in the market? But that I think is kind of like a later in the year, maybe next year type of a thing. But right now it's more focused on companies or startups that are in the space.
I was going to say, and being on the vendor side, I think that's huge. I mean, so oftentimes seeing commercialization and scaling done incorrectly is, so many companies fail because of that. So it's fascinating to see.
Yeah, and vendor relationship was something that I really wanted to talk about at Innovation Gathering, Network Gathering, because when you think about innovation, there's so many vendors that are in the space, like you said, Brad. There's tons when you look at it, and it can be quite, kind of like it can make you very dizzy because there's so many different vendors. And when you think about the sites who are like, look, I just want to get patients in, and then the sponsor's like, but we got this new vendor. And you're like, great, I already got to deal with the CRO. Now I got this other vendor who's on my back. And then it's like there may be a new system that they want you to do. And you're like, great, another login I got to deal with. And so you have all these different players. And it's like, where are we actually listening to our sites properly? But then are we also listening to our vendors when they say, you cannot keep pulling me in when the house is already on fire and damn near burned down? Can you bring me in earlier so we can work together on this? So I wanted to kind of highlight this idea of having better relationships, so not having it be transactional, but be more of a strategic partnership. Can you bring them in early and long term and do better with kind of presenting them to sites as to why they need to work with and say, here's what they're hearing from you that they're incorporating. So I wanted to highlight that, but also put a little bit of levity in it, just to like, because it can be, people kind of will roll their eyes at. I know pharma's like, okay, here we go being told that we're the bad guys. But I felt like it was nice when I had vendors come up to me after watching it like in person, but also watching it when it was live online. They were like, someone finally heard us. Like, we've never had anybody really highlight that. So I think me being independent now and not having corporate tag allowed me to do that. So
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to bring this up. I think it kind of ties in because I think as sites, something I am seeing. Well, first of all, I'll say we're sort of in like between a rock and a hard place because we want to see better solutions, and you know, I don't want to say more vendors, but at least vendors who are appropriately solving problems that we see as problems. But to your point, you know, we're being bombarded oftentimes by random vendors, and now I'm seeing a big uptick in, you know, vendors reaching directly to sites and saying like, hey, we want to come out, we want to see like how things work, we want you to try out our solution for a little while. And that's a hard place for a site to be in because I want to help contribute to making, you know, solving a problem, but then to try out a new product or demo something, I've got to rework a whole process or workflow. I've got to get my staff on board who's then pissed off at me because I'm like, no, we're trying a new thing every 2 months because someone asked me and I want to like help. So I think it oftentimes puts us in a very hard position because, you know, you don't want to be like, no, leave us alone. But you also don't want to be like, again, like you said, I got to get patients in the door or we ain't gonna keep the doors open, you know?
right.
So like, yeah, I mean, do you see a balance to that in some way, or like even vendors offering something to sites to make this? Because again, I think we all want to solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
And I think we all have to be willing to, you know, be a part of making it better. But am I missing something, or is that just this is how it has to be?
I think it's kind of like a learning curve that we're in right now where there's always has to be some set of sites that are willing to try it, right? Because there's going to be some other sites that are like, I don't want to be the first, but I'll wait till you get some others, like investors, right? Well, I'll come in when you get some other sites, right? And I think the biggest part too is I've noticed that vendors are starting to do that more because one, when you're going through the sponsor, you have no idea how the sponsor is actually presenting you to a site. So is it more of like you're required to, and if you don't, you can't be on a trial, or is it more like, hey, here's an offering for you? A lot of times it's more of like, hey, if you want to be on this trial, this is what you got. And so sites are like, Jesus Christ. So I think what they're trying to do is come in from the actual end user and say, does this work for you? If not, you know, what can we do? So you're trying to go to that person who would actually be using it and not from, you know, their, you know, higher ups that are like always telling you what they think is best when it's not. And so I think that's where you have to give and take, but also understand that a lot of sites are still even seeing patients on a day-to-day, right? Like, hey, have people coming in, hey, we're going to do regular patient care. So as much as I want to dedicate time to this, how can we do that? So there's also others that I see, you know, vendors kind of pairing up with others who will say, hey, don't worry about it. We can bring in another, you know, partner of ours who could provide you with the staffing that you need so that if you want to try it out, you can kind of see how it works without really draining from your day-to-day. So I've seen some very creative partnerships come up with that. And I think that also helps too when sponsors are offering those types of things where they're like, hey, we understand your staff is overworked. Here's another one that's going to come in and kind of set up shop, you know, mobilely or whatever the case may be and kind of help you guys out. So I think this is a perfect time to be creative. But I also tell sites too, if you don't speak up, your voice will never be heard. But I also know from being on pharma side, when we would go to sites and you ask them for their opinion and they do all those questionnaires and they do those roundtables and none of that gets included, they're just like, why are you bothering us? Right. So I think it has to be where people have to own up where their shortcomings are in each side of the coin, and then be able to say, how do we bring that together?
Well, it's such an interesting landscape, particularly in this industry and others too, where the buyer is not the user. And so you're having people making the purchasing decisions who never use it. So I guess trying to mitigate that, like you mentioned, makes sense. But then there's the additional complexities where maybe even the user isn't the user, where it's being passed to the patient as well. And then you're having like this like game of bad telephone.
So bad. It gets worse as you go along. I think the other thing too is a lot of times you're like, oh, well, we're going to talk to the doctor. And sometimes it's not even them, it's the site coordinator that's doing it. So you're like, Do they
more
even
often than not.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And the PI's like, oh yeah, we can do it. And your psych coordinator is like, don't we already have two other things that do that? And we did not like that setup. So I think this is where you start to see where the communication falls apart. PIs are complaining about the CROs and sponsors, and it's like, but your team's probably saying the same thing about you. So I think this is where people have to have the hard truths about themselves. And I see that we're starting to get that more and more because there's a lot of accountability building up in the industry. But I think we're just going to see a lot of consolidation as well, because there's a lot of vendors that are very similar that might end up kind of consolidating together or partnering together. And I think that that's fine. I mean, I just was at Scope. We were talking about, do we see the opportunity for vendors to, like, they were like, we know there's not one vendor that can do it all, right? And I'm like, great. I'm glad that pharma's starting to understand that. And are you okay with you having, instead of one vendor, maybe four, but they're all doing different things? But now you have to have true coordination. And we all know how things get very siloed in pharma. So this is where I think bringing them all to the table at the same time so they all know who is doing what is very important. Because there's been projects where vendors would not know that there was another vendor. But you're hearing about these things. You're like, well, who's doing that? And you hear about it because they talk about it to each other. But I think it's better to bring everybody to the table and say, here's who these people are. And you have those team meetings that they can talk to each other and not have this miscommunication that I see happening a lot.
I mean, that's kind of crazy. I didn't realize that would be the case. If like vendors don't know that another vendor is part of the project or part of the study.
100%.
And I mean, something else that you mentioned that like has kind of taken me like embarrassingly long to recognize is that, a lot of times the vendor, it could be a great vendor with a great solution, but if it's rolled out and integrated poorly by the sponsor, like I hate it. And so I'm like, and then only to find out later, like maybe on another study, like, oh, this actually works great. Or the solution is amazing, but the sponsor added something dumb. They didn't roll it out right. It was presented in a way that's like, this isn't a choice or whatever the case may be. Yeah. So I'm kind of blown away sometimes. And I've also learned to maybe reserve judgment a little more than I should.
Yeah, you should. And I tell a lot of the companies, startups that I work with and vendors, I'm like, give me 1 to 2 slides that really explain what your thing is. Because you can tell me, and a lot of times I'm pretty good at being able to communicate it, but when I pass it on to someone else, it's going to get lost. So give me the slides and I can say, read from these slides or share these slides with your sites. That way there is no miscommunication, and you even put in there who they should contact if they have questions. So that way you're not doing this, can I call this person? Oh, wait, let me pull you through to another person. And you're waiting, right? Because you're getting passed on. And, everybody hates that when you're calling in to like your insurance or anything like that. And you're like, oh, please hold. And you're like, or it's like this long email chain. And you're like, I don't even know who the hell I even emailed to start this off. And you're like 15 people deep. So I think that's another way where you can kind of prevent that from happening, where the sponsor doesn't do a great job, but now you have those slides that can kind of mitigate that as best as possible.
I mean, I've heard, I don't know, is it true that like oftentimes sponsors don't want vendors working or speaking directly to sites even? Like they want it to go through the sponsor contact, which again seems sort of insane to me, but is that really happening? Yeah, is that happening in the background?
But you know what's funny about that? They'll say because sites don't want to be bothered.
100, yep. I've heard that line.
So we're assuming, okay, sites don't want to be bothered. But then every once in a while, you'll have it where you talk to sites and they're like, I don't mind. I'm like,
Well, not only do I not mind, but like, I mean, look, the chain of command at a site is like to reach out to your CRA.
Yes.
Probably, I mean, I love CRAs, and frankly, I feel like they're super underappreciated in so many ways, but they don't know how to troubleshoot my tablet that I can't get working. They don't know.
Right.
Generally. So
right.
They're going to ask someone else who's going to ask someone else. I'm eventually going to end up calling a help desk or something anyway. So just let me reach out to the vendor who knows their product extremely well and can actually help me solve it immediately.
So that's what they try to do at some pharma companies, where they'll have like a primary point person. You tell them your problem and they would triage it to the correct team. So that way everything flows through one. They're tracking who's saying what, and they're showing you who the right person is. But I do think that their biggest thing is they're trying to maintain that relationship, because we all know that when you have a middleman, let's say like a CRO, how sites feel about them. And there have been times where sites would be like, CRO, I don't care. I'm going to go talk to the sponsor. So you're like, and the CRO is like, but I'm supposed to be managing it. You're like, So like I could see them having a little bit of hesitancy because of that, in the sense of, well, if they're bypassing a CRO, they might just bypass a vendor and come talk to us still. But I think this is where you have to still show who is doing what and what company and things along those lines, and allow them to have that type of line of communication. But it's all about control. You want to kind of control the narrative as best as possible.
So one thing I've been wondering about, talking about like transparency, bringing different vendors together, making them aware. What do you think the landscape is for vendors willing to work together? Because I think there's a lot of competition of folks who aren't necessarily particularly willing to share and work together.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out?
Oh, honestly, I think they don't have a choice at this point, right? Because like it's getting to a point now where it's like, you guys may be working with the same client, but in two different portfolios, right? Is there a way that you guys can kind of partner together and say, could we up this to enterprise? So now I'm not just on lung cancer studies and you're not just on IBD studies. Could we actually raise the bar and say, could we go across the board, especially if you're the type that has the ability to do that, right? Or if you're like, hey, I'm doing one component that's regarding sites, you're doing another. Could we offer this as a joint package, right? Could there be a way for our systems to, to actually speak to each other, so that when we present, the site's like, oh wait, I already used these two, and they talk to each other? Great. So I think there's opportunities for that, because right now, with how the market and the industry is changing right now, and we're seeing a lot of push on what has been the impact. How are you demonstrating your impact? Budgets are being reduced because they're trying to account for all the changes that are happening. This is where I think you have to start to be very creative. And I think a lot of times when you look at, and this is the other thing too, sponsors like to think that some vendors do the exact same thing, but they don't. I've noticed that they'll say, oh, well, they're both doing, DEI work. And you're like, yes, but not in the same way. So I've noticed that. Or they're like, oh, well, they're both doing, patient identification. You go, yes, but not in the way that you're thinking. So I think this is where vendors have to do a good job with highlighting, here's how we differentiate from the others that you guys probably work with. Here's how we could possibly work with them, because we know you guys have a long-standing relationship with them. Highlighting that you're willing to work with sometimes will elevate you to be a little bit of a higher choice in the matter. But I've seen a lot of vendors come together and say, can we just do these joint proposals together? And those have actually done a pretty good job in some cases I've seen. I've even suggested to some, you guys should partner together. And this is how I think you guys should partner to make that happen. So
that makes sense. And I think, something else you touched on briefly that I'm kind of curious about, consolidation. I mean, I feel like, again, I'm not particularly educated about the consolidation side or M&A, whatever, but it seemed to me like I expected maybe more. Do you think there's more coming? I mean, at this point, is that something you think we should expect to see more consolidation across these vendors?
I mean, it always happens. Every year you do see it. It's just on what scale is it? This year is a little bit of a weird one, right? Like you're still seeing some acquisitions happen. Is
this a weird year for some reason?
And, like you can see it.
I don't know.
Things are still happening, but not like it usually is. Like you see like changes in valuations that are happening. Investments are like a little bit lower. You hear a lot of investors are like, hey, we're not investing this time. We're going to focus more on our portfolio companies. And you still see some companies who are a little bit larger who are like, maybe this is the perfect time for us to get them at the price that we want. So I do see it happening. It may be more happening on the AI side because everybody loves AI. And you see a lot of that stuff happening where it's like, okay, do you guys actually have a model, or are you just putting AI on it to make it sound nice? And I think there's going to be a lot of correction in that space. But I do see others where when you think about, in some cases where you're looking at patient recruitment, and there may be some companies that are in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And companies are like, look, I know you guys are probably struggling right now. Could there be a way for us to partner together, or could we pull you into our portfolio of offerings? Because we don't have that. And we could see where we could have you guys add value. So there are probably going to be some pretty interesting conversations being had in that. But I think it just depends. I mean, usually the first quarter, you can never really tell. And I would say you'll probably start to heat up in Q2, Q3, but I think there's an opportunity. But I feel like if you're the type of person who sees this as an opportunity and not a challenge, then you probably will see that happening. But if you're going to be more on the scared side and be a little bit more reserved, then no, I don't think so. So.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And that's not the saying is, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. Some sort of, probably some old rich guy said that at one point.
Which is why he's rich.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're terrified then? Is that where we're landing?
Pretty much.
Right.
So yeah, you mentioned, so look, let's just say it's been a weird year. Vaguely. And it feels like a lot of what we have known to value about clinical research has been, maybe a little under attack, let's say. I don't know. I guess let's talk a little bit about, I know you're passionate about representation, in clinical research. Where do we stand, man? What do we do? I know that, I think we're still seeing, at least, I don't know, it's hard to know from the site side, but we're still asked in feasibilities about, what we can do to increase diversity and increase representation across clinical trials. I don't know to what degree that's actually being valued versus, a question to answer. But I mean, sort of, where does that leave us?
Honestly, it's the way it is going right now. I'm not too shocked by it. Because when this was all taking off in 2020, and you saw a lot of companies lean in, there were still some companies who were very quiet. And you're going to continue to see that, where some will be quiet, some will say we will walk the line because, hey, whatever happens, we're going to follow the laws and regulations that are in place. And then others are going to double down and say, that's great that this administration doesn't agree with it, but we know what's good for us, right? Like in the sense of, if you're going to have a business that is focused on health, you have to make sure that the vast majority of people who are going to be taking your therapy or implanting this medical device that it actually works for them. So I think the biggest thing, right? It's a weird concept. Like for me, I always laugh at, they tell you to diversify your portfolio, but they don't see the point in diversifying your patient population. And I hate that they always view it as a challenge, like, oh, it's going to be too long. It takes too much money. They don't trust. And I'm like, this is why we're in the place that we're in right now. So I think that for the companies that are doubling down, and you even see this in other sectors as well, right, who are like, we're going to still do what we're going to do. So what if our shareholders want us to consider this proposal? We're not going to do it. I think that's the part that is kind of refreshing for me, that I see companies that are still willing to double down and aren't scared to say, hey, we're still going to continue to do this. I don't fault a company for trying to adapt. So you might see changes in the name of it not being diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. They may call it more inclusive research or belonging or health equity, which equity in itself is now being, attacked. So I see them trying to shift so that the target isn't on them. And I don't knock any vendor who changes that, any smaller company, startup who does that, any larger company, right? Because at the end of the day, you are a business. You are trying to make money, right? But at the same time, you have to say to yourself about the integrity and how are you going to be able, once we come out of this, look, are you going to be okay with that perception of you down the road? Are you going to be okay with the fact that you might lose market share because you no longer are looking at all people, you're just looking at a certain amount? And I think, are you also prepared for the fact that when your drugs go and are approved and are on the market, that you might end up getting some recalls or black label because of the fact that now that you're in a larger population, that you're starting to see these issues. So that is something that I think they have to be prepared for. And I hate the fact that there are a lot of my colleagues who are at these companies who are having to deal with the external as well as the internal battles that are happening. And I've talked to a few and they're like, it is insane, right? That we're getting hit from all ends on, well, I don't have to do this, to, am I allowed to still do this? And so you're hearing that internally, and then you go out and live your experiences as a person from these, groups and communities that are under attack, and you have to deal with that day to day, right? So it's a lot of wear and tear on people that I'm seeing in the industry, which is very sad. Working in DEI field is already a very tiring sector, and there isn't a lot of reward that comes with it. You try to keep it in a bigger picture that, hey, we're actually making an impact, but how much of you is being compromised in that? So I think as a whole, the industry will probably balance itself out, but people are talking, people see what is happening, people see what teams are being cut. And I think that's where that perception, where optics is king, is where a lot of these companies will have to kind of face the music once we get out of the storm.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And I've seen a friend who's in a DEI role, I guess, I go, even when things were more favorable in terms of, again, I want to say good, because it's probably never been good per se, but, in a more favorable, that it was tough. And then after all this, basically leaving the position and having to deal with all the bullshit that's sort of come along with it. And again, I can't admittedly even begin to imagine like what that must be like, but I know that people are, having to suffer through the consequences. And, yeah, I'm with you. I do think we're playing, for lack of a better word, it's a long game, right? And things do tend to swing or come to a balance. And yeah, people are gonna, this shit's out there. You're gonna be able to see who responds how.
Yeah, and I think for me, when I think about beyond just as part of representation, just the idea of science, like I just saw online, was hearing about how, these research conferences that are coming up, right? How now you have them worried about, like, well, if we're talking about these things or even have the word diversity, what does that actually mean? Like, are we going to be attacked on this? And it's kind of interesting when you think about, well, where are some of these conferences being held? They're in red states. Do people feel safe enough to go there? And I hate to say that, but that's something that a lot of people are thinking about, right? Like this is the truth that we're living in right now. And I think that when you are having your own lived experiences, and now people who usually have never been impacted by this are now being impacted by these things, are going, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? And people who have been attacked all the time are like, welcome to my world. This is me day in and day out once I popped up into this world, right? So I think and then people are like, well, where's the passion? Where's the empathy, from you guys? And you're like, I'm sorry, where was it before? So you're starting to see these conversations that were very quiet, muted, pushed under the rug for so long. And they're expecting people from marginalized communities, underserved communities to come and be the savior. And it's like, why? Why are you asking that of us? So I think this is where we're starting to see that. And now, even when you think about in pharma, patients are becoming more empowered, and you're starting to see the impact of the costs of medication is really starting to hit. Now they're starting to look at this and go, wait a minute. Why does it cost so much? Because I know personally people who, went in for their medication. Last year wasn't that much. It was maybe like $50, which is still pretty expensive. But now you're seeing this as being like at $500. And you go, why is that? It's just a few months. Why is my medication so much? And now you have people having to make the decisions. Do I buy this or do I pay my bills? So it's a lot that's happening that I think now people who didn't see themselves fitting into the umbrella of DEI are now starting to fill it. And now they're going, oh, that's what it means. It wasn't just Black. I got it. So.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll see how that continues to unfold. It's going to be maybe a long few years.
It's going to be bad. It's going to be a hard one. I think it's going to be very, very hard. I don't think people are prepared for it.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll find out one way or the other way.
Yeah.
It's like God made beer, right?
Hey, a lot of us are just sitting back like, you know what? I don't know what else to tell you, right? Like it's at a point now where it's just, we have to see where it falls. And I think the part that really bothers me the most is people who did not want this are still being impacted, and that my day-to-day is being impacted by someone else's decision. I think that's the part that hurts the most, right? And it's just like when you think about companies that are trying to adjust to adapt to what's happening, there are teams that are being, completely removed, and that individual is now having to make the choice of, how do I find a new job when so many other people are losing their jobs? Where do I go in this space when there's no opportunities that are there?
Yeah, and I think that's something even before it seemed apparent to me. Like, you have so many people getting laid off, and there's not enough jobs for all the people who, good, talented, experienced people. So it's crazy. It's crazy. I have no other words than that. Let's see. We don't have a whole lot of comments today. If you guys got questions or comments, kind of coming up on the last 15-20 minutes, so shoot them out. Do you see this happen? What's up, Christian? He's worked for vendors who want to engage with sites, but they avoid it because sites aren't direct buyers. I get it. I have people come to me and they have solutions, and I'm like, hey, cool. If I did this, what would it cost? And they give me some absurd number, and I'm like, cool, see ya. I do think it's still not a terrible idea. I mean, is there some value in getting sites like on your side at least? Because we are occasionally asked like, who are good vendors? If you got, I think the site voice has gotten louder over the last few years, and if sites are saying we like this, will that have a true impact? Or I feel like so often it's still kind of like the old boys club of like, good old boys club of who gets these vendor contracts because you keep using the same people even though they're
terrible.
The greatest. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I've seen that a lot. And I think it is true that there are some who are like, well, we have a secret sauce. We don't want other people to see it. And a part of me, it's like, I understand it, especially when you're smaller and it may be a larger partner that's trying to come in, you kind of do give a side eye on it a little bit. But I also feel as though you're missing out on so many opportunities, right? And I do know that there are a lot of people in pharma who are listening to sites. And if a site says, I like this and I use this, and there's a large number of their selected sites that use it, then they'll pull that vendor in because they're like, it's less of a resistance from our sites. We're not introducing something new to them. They already like it. They're using it. They are comfortable with it. There's less questions coming to us. So I do think that there is opportunity there, but collaboration is tricky when you don't know, and you have to talk this through with contracting, right? Are you a subcontractor for them, or are they a subcontractor for you? How is this actually going to work? And I've seen all kinds of stuff come through procurement. Procurement has their hands full when it comes to this type of stuff. And I think the biggest thing is when you think about what does that actually, look like from a partnership perspective, that's where you have to have those conversations on who owns what, who's doing what metrics are we tying you to, KPIs. But I do think that there is some secret sauce piece with it. But overall, I do think it's like, it's tough. I don't knock them for wanting to be a little bit hesitant, but at the same time, I feel like there's money to be had, right? Let's try to do something together. Let's see if we can double what we typically get on our contracts and maybe pull in a $3 to $4 million contract. Who wouldn't want that? I know your investors would love that. So,
yeah, fair point. And I'd say there's been very few. Well, I've seen vendors come out and show me things that I'm like, oh, I can do that myself. I don't need a vendor to do that. But also, honestly, then that's not a model that's going to hold up very long over the long term, because people are going to figure out like, oh, if I can do that myself at no cost or much lower cost, then maybe your business model is not particularly good. Some things are just going to fail, right?
The other thing too, think about it is, hey, at least I changed the industry because now people should be doing this. Like my job was to try and get this implemented. Would I like to make some money off of it? Absolutely. But I still had impact, right? But no, I think
I agree with that. Also like just, hey man, if you fixed it, that's good. Who cares? Maybe you're not going to cash out for millions, but you fixed a big problem. Then there's something to be said about that, And even then, like, I don't know, people call me and are like, how do I start a site? And I'll be like, you know what? I'll tell you every step and they still won't do it. Most people are not going to do it, even if you tell them everything there is to it. Christian elaborates. Yeah, you know, you want to know the secret for KFC's chicken? It's out there, man. Are you going to start your own chicken company and put KFC out of business? Probably not.
No,
So,
you know how many steps are involved in that? No,
yeah,
thank
right,
you.
right.
That's the part, right? Like it's like people want to know how you did it, but then when they actually hear how many steps, they're like, oh God, I don't want to do that. This is why I said entrepreneurship is hard.
Well, and it goes back to what you said in the beginning, which I think resonates with a lot of people, is like, how do you do something that you give a shit about and are deeply passionate about, but then also make money doing it, right? Like,
Yes.
And there's no reason that you can't do both.
Correct.
And I mean, I feel like that's sort of the ideal way to live, right? Like actually doing something that you want to get up for Monday morning and spend your weekends or whatever doing, right?
Yeah. But unfortunately, a lot of us are not blessed with waking up with a job that we actually like, right? Which is sad. I hate that. You're
true.
wasting away your best years. And you're like, for what? What am I doing this for?
To make somebody else a lot of money.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I know. It's easier said than done. And it took me a long time to figure it out myself. So
yeah.
Let's set up another question here. How often are sites visited by sponsors? We hear sponsors are deciding things for the site. I don't know how much of that is grounded in actual interaction / feedback versus way outdated assumptions.
I know visits were happening a lot more prior to COVID. And then once COVID hit, there's like, can we do this virtually? And then it was like, do I even need to come see you if I've been working with you for X number of studies or years? And I get it. When sponsors come to visit, it's a whole big deal. It's like everybody knows the suits are coming, and you're like, okay, we got to do all these things while still trying to make sure this site doesn't burn down, because we still have patients coming in. We still have other studies that are coming in. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on into a visit. I think it still does happen, but I think could it be done better? Absolutely. I do think that with the feasibility questionnaires, when you have companies that have multiple studies, sending out a very similar feasibility questionnaire that's like 50 questions long, and you're like, I already answered these. I answered these.
Surely I would never do that.
No. And you're like answering the same questions over and over again. So you have some sponsors who are trying to be smart and say, okay, here's one big one at the beginning of the year. Everybody fills it out. And then we'll only send you smaller ones that are relevant to the trial. And if it's for one disease area, we'll try to do it for, like, if there's like 5 IBD studies or 5 breast cancer studies, we'll try to have you answer all these questions so that we don't have to come back to you every time the new study starts. So I think you're starting to see that more. But the visits, it's like, when you do those type of visits, what's the purpose? Right.
And I think, it's a very fine line for sites. And I've heard people be like, oh, well, sites don't want sponsors out there. They're busy. And I'm like, yeah, but I would rather have a strong and like good relationship with a sponsor than 5 CROs. I mean, not that I don't want them for CROs, but I've even, I've done presentations where like sponsors are in the audience and they're like, oh, we don't know this stuff is happening because our CRO is managing it and it never gets back to us. And I'm like, hey, cool. What are you doing? Like, you got to come out and talk to the sites, because ultimately, like, the work we're doing is for them, right? Not for the CRO to cash billable hours or whatever the case may be, which I feel like is what's happening ever so, pretty often. And I found, I don't know if it's because like we're getting a little bit older as a company, but we're seeing more sponsors come out and do what you're talking about, kind of try to have higher level pipeline or therapeutic area relationships by which we're not having to one off these FQs over God knows what, and they're getting to know us as a bigger entity versus study by study transaction. So I think there needs to be way more of it, for sure.
Do you think that's relation to the size of your organization, or just more the climate and how CROs are interacting differently now? You're seeing changes in like CRO models that sponsors are engaging with. Do you think it's both, one or the other? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, because I do hear a little bit more is coming in house maybe at sponsors now. There's that cycle that tends to happen, but I also think part of it's that maybe like I've stuck it out long enough and grown enough, because I think when I was small, no one gave a shit. Just go get a study and give us patients, see you, and now as you get further along, I think that,
Yeah,
can happen.
because you've built up, reputation on what you can actually do, right? But I've also heard on the other flip side too that there's a lot of legacy sites of KOLs that are well known in the industry who have not done well with recruitment for the past few studies or years, and yet they're always chosen. And yet you have these sites who are begging for a trial, who get overlooked because they're like, well, we don't know you, or you're just an upcoming rising star in the space. And I think that's starting to change because it's like you can't keep drawing from the same well and it's dry. There's no patience there. And you're putting in a lot of money into opening up that site and sending over supplies for what? So I think you're starting to see this shift where smaller sites are really starting to clean up shop a little bit. And less known sites are really starting to become more towards the forefront because of the fact that there's so much more competition with trials. Like it died down during COVID and then it started to really explode afterwards. So you're starting to see more of sponsors starting to cannibalize themselves where they have like 3 studies in the same disease area, but they're all going to the same site. So like, well, we're going to go to Dr. Smith here, and at the same site, I'll go to Dr. Jones. But it's like, and then you have to alternate between them. Like, okay, well, talk about this trial here, and then when we hit this point, then talk about this trial here. So there's a really weird dynamic that's going on right now, but I think it's more of a force.
Goes back to diversification. All right, put all your eggs in one basket, no matter what that basket is.
Correct. Correct.
Crazy how those themes, just pervade everything, right?
It's almost like it could be good business practice or something.
No, not at all. It has to be merit based.
Very good. Very good.
Oh.
Well, okay. So we got 10 minutes. Let's keep it. Let's have some fun with it. So you're into embroidery. Tell us about embroidery.
Yeah, that's my old lady hobby.
Yeah.
I felt as though, I have always been very intrigued by when you look at some of these artwork that's done by embroidery. I'm like, God, that's so cool. And when I realized that you could actually do it, just takes a little bit of time of learning different stitch, understanding about your yarn. I was like, oh, and it's really nice because you can actually have something going on in the background. So like I'll be doing some embroidery and watching anime or documentary or a movie, and I'll do that. Right. And they're very easy. You can start off with really simple patterns and go to very complex ones. So I'm still in the very early stages of it, of like, I can do some really nice, artwork, but I haven't gotten to the point where I've seen like some really cool, like animal portraits, and they do like this, like changing of colors, like this gradient. And I'm like, God, I want to get to that point, or start to do like the 3D art or 3D embroidery. I'm like, oh, I want to get to that point, but it's going to take some time. And for a person who doesn't have patience, this is really pushing me to my limits of saying, how do I become more patient? Okay. So, but I do love it. I find it very relaxing. And the fact that I don't have to be on my phone or by a computer and I can just sit with myself. I love that. But I also like to read too. So that's my way of being able to kind of like disconnect. So
yeah, it's almost like one of those sort of meditative activities where like you got to pay attention to what you're doing. You get a little maybe flow state thing going on. You're not worried about whatever's happening on your phone. Or
correct.
Yeah, I like that. And then I know that you're also a beer enthusiast, from my understanding. What's your favorite style of beer, I guess?
Imperial stouts.
Okay.
The big boys.
Any particular recommendations?
Oh man, there's way too many. I have to say, people are really shocked when they see me and I tell them I like Imperial stouts, because they're like, those are like 12, 13, 14. So I'm like, yes.
There's no joke.
Yes. I'm like, they're some big boys. And I do love them because, one, I've always appreciated more of like the smokiness that's with it, especially when it's barrel aged. And the hints of chocolate that are usually with it, vanilla, like I really like that profile. Porters aren't too bad, but sometimes when they're a little too heavy on that coffee part, I'm like, and I'm not a big coffee drinker. Like I don't drink coffee at all. I love the smell of it. So love porters for the smell. I can't do too many of them. Beers that I'm really not a big fan of are the Imperial IPAs. That's when you get kicked in the teeth with
too
bitterness.
hoppy. So
hoppy. Man,
yeah.
That's like your tongue only can go so high with bitter before it like can't distinguish anymore. But I do love how diverse I love them. Probably how diverse beer
Look at
is.
that. Full
You can go
circle.
from
Nice callback.
right, right. And there was this one. It was a beer that was like it was a golden stout, and I love that because you look at it and you go, "Oh, what is this?" But then you smell it and you taste, and you're like, "Oh, now this." I love those type of beers, or like bitters, or ones that incorporate fruit in it. I love those types of beers because those are just like they're so different in their flavor profile. But I do like to try all different kinds of styles of beer. But the beer industry is also taking a big hit right now too. And when you think about imports for their grain and for their hops and for any others, I could see them really getting hit really hard right now. And brick and mortar really took a huge hit during COVID. So a lot of them did not survive at all. They did not survive. So
Well, if you ever end up in Madison, there's a place that does a stout ice cream sundae. Or no, like a root beer float, like a stout float. So they'd have beer flavored ice cream that they put into a stout.
oh, man.
So take you out.
Oh, see, I've always done like chocolate shakes with Guinness, and I'm like, those things are amazing. You're like, this is great. I feel so happy right now. But I've done all kinds of stuff. And I used to grow my own hops when I used to live in Michigan. So had my little hop vines and everything. So I've done all kinds of stuff, brewed my own beer. I've released a beer commercially once before. So I've done all kinds of stuff.
A woman of many talents.
A woman of many talents. Exactly. Exactly.
I love it. I mean, I think that's a nice, perfect stopping point. Denise, any final words?
I think right now, I would say have a little bit more grace and compassion for your fellow person, not just because of what's happening. It's just a very trying time overall. I know a lot of people who are dealing with health issues, whether it's themselves or family or friends. The job market is being impacted. Just overall, we've got all kinds of stuff running amok, from flu, measles, RSV, like everything you could think of under the sun. So the fact that people are just tired, and a lot of people have been carrying a lot of burdens, I just say to people, give a little bit more grace. But I also want to challenge the industry to, not bend, right? Like let's really, we're impacting lives in a way that is on a very large scale. And as a species, we're one of the few that can actually impact other species on this planet. So for me, it's like, I don't want to see the industry bend when we have made so much progress, especially when you're thinking about just overall health. But I also wish that companies would move beyond trying to treat symptoms and look at how do we do better with diagnosis, prevention, right? And even aftercare. So even when a person goes into remission, are we still providing them the support that they need? That's what I would want them to think about. That's what I want to leave people with.
I love it. Denise, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks everybody out there. Denali, thank you for your premiere co-host.
She did great. She should do more of these.
She's stuck now, so perfect. All right, guys. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.